Here is my in-depth look at Frank Zappa's Peaches and Regalia, the winner of the poll for December. It's such a quirky, humorous, multifaceted, complex piece of music, and I really enjoyed spending time with it. Now, for a lot of people, just enjoying the end result is all they want to do. Maybe understand a little bit about special features or meaningful elements. But as a musician, I love to go further because we are the ones who have to make this stuff. Meaning, even if we aren't composing it ourselves, we're performing it or teaching it, or you get the idea. Which means we have to be able to take it down to its smallest parts and then put it back together again, because if we can't do that, that means we don't really understand it well enough. Now, if that sounds too technical of an approach for something as beautiful or impactful as music, well, what can I say? Don't become a musician? But it's not all about the science of it, of course. That's just one side of it. We also have to be able to understand the emotional side of it as well. Not just by letting it wash over us, because then we're following behind. We have to be in the lead, since we are responsible for directing and shaping its course. So our way, my way, of enjoying and consuming music is, we could say, proactive rather than reactive. Now, of course, some music leans more towards the emotional side, while other music is more technical or more intellectual. But regardless, we want to get a good understanding of it, understanding every facet of the music. In this piece, Peaches and Regalia is a lot more complicated than much of the music I've listened to on this Virgin Rock channel so far. Not just complex in one or two different ways, maybe complex rhythmically or very rich melodically or something like that, but in many different ways. When first hearing it, there's so much going on that we can't fully take it in all in the first time around. You saw that on my first listen video. And if you didn't, here's the link. But after several times through, it does begin to settle into place, and we can enjoy more and more of the details, as well as grasp more of what it is overall. But how do we really unravel a piece like this? Where do we start? How do we take it down into the smallest bits? Well, typically, we start with the big picture and gradually whittle things down from there. And I'd like us to try that with Peaches and Regalia, and let's see how far we get. Of course, we won't go all the way because it's too much for one session. As I said, this piece is very complex and has a lot of layers, but I think we will get far enough to appreciate and to understand just how good of a piece this is, and the musical talent and brains that went into creating it. So, big picture first. Let's figure out the overall shape of this piece to give us a good launching point. First, we have this arresting drum flourish at the opening, and it just comes with this wonderful energy. And then there's a sort of what I would call an introduction passage, where we hear some really great instrumental parts shared by the guitar and the piano. There's this wonderfully proud descending line of chords, which we hear on the guitar. And then it is finished by a flashy arpeggio flourish from the piano. Something kind of like this. This is what the guitar would be playing. And then the piano comes in to finish and polish that off by going something like this. And so it blends together into this wonderful unit of sound where both of those instruments are working in tandem, together. As we look at the structural shape of the piece, we begin to notice something really interesting, at least to me. It follows a format which is found in a lot of complex and highly developed classical music. And it's a fairly formal format. We call it the Sonata allegro form. And the thing that's so appealing to composers of complex and also long musical works about this format is that it provides a sort of structural framework within which they can present and explore multiple musical ideas, while at the same time, it allows creative freedom. That way, the end result doesn't flop around on the beach like a fish out of water, so to speak. But it also doesn't have to feel rigid and contrived. Notice I say it doesn't have to feel rigid and contrived. Because, of course, handled incompetently or unimaginatively, it certainly can and does at times come out sounding incredibly stiff and academic, or boring and technical. Think of it like the essay format. There's a basic outline which helps the writer to organize and present the content effectively. And as we all know, a good essay is wonderful reading. It's a great experience. Whereas a mechanical essay is, well, just that. Let's say the Sonata allegro form is our structural format for a musical essay. Let's say the Sonata allegro form is our structural format for a musical essay. And here is the basic outline, the map, the design of Sonata allegro form. So, in every piece that follows this format, we have the first main section, which is called the Exposition. And we'll map it out like this, and we'll just title it Exposition. Now, some pieces building off of this form have an intro beforehand, so we'll give a little chunk at the beginning, and we'll title this the Introduction. Going back to the Exposition, the setup for this chunk of the piece is two primary themes. So we have theme 1, and then we have theme 2. Now, each of these two themes, musically, is its very own musical idea. Then we get to usually the longest, biggest, most elaborate part of the music, which is also the most free form. And this is titled the Development. Now, in the development, it's up to the composer what he wants to do. He can develop and explore and play around with either or both of the two exposition themes, or anything else he wants. This is the portion where he has absolute freedom. Now, of course, there are standard classical conventions which show up a lot, but it's not a requirement, and we find lots of examples throughout music history where those conventions weren't followed to incredible artistic effect. So, development is basically free-form development, and it's large chunk. Then, sometimes at the end of the development, we have a little section which is called a cadenza. And basically, that is a virtuosic, solo, showy passage that both draws on the musical content which has been experienced up to now in the music, as well as very often adding something original, unique. And this is the place where the soloist gets to show off their technical prowess, very much like in rock music, there's a guitar solo very often where it's flashy and it's very show-offy many times. Then, the last main chunk of the piece is called the recapitulation. Essentially, what we have here is, most times, we go back and restate the thematic material which was first presented in the exposition. And then finally, at the very end, we have sometimes a coda. Not a requirement. So again, the three primary required shapes, designs in this structure is exposition, development, recapitulation. Now, all of these others are optional. They're often present, sometimes one or the other, or all three of them. And that is our roadmap for creating a musical essay, as we are going to say. Now let's see how this compares to what we find in the Zappa piece. First, we already met the introduction. Then we come to the exposition, the first main portion of the piece. And here is where we first meet what I am going to call theme 1. That's what we hear as something like bum, da-da-dum, bum, 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 and it continues a little bit longer. After that, we come to theme 2, which is what I am going to nickname the horn beeping jazzy part, because I made a comment in my first listen that it was kind of like suddenly some horns beeping. Then, after a little bit of a transition, we come to the next main portion, which is the development. That's the part, remember, which gives the most freedom for the composer. And in this piece of music, that's the part that sounds rather oriental. And just like in a standard sonata allegro design, this section is in a different key from what came before. Zappa really goes crazy here, in a good way. It's inventive, totally contrasting from the first section, featuring a more florid melody, but instead of just repeating that melody several times over, notice what he does with it. Extracting a segment and kind of messing around with it, taking it through all kinds of intricate twists and turns, sometimes short, sometimes longer. Sometimes we realize partway through a series of short segments that actually they are all linking together to form one long, winding path through the maze. Zappa takes the route of mostly developing new material that wasn't stated in the exposition. But it's not totally unrelated. If it weren't for the key change and all, it would be easier to notice because it's quite camouflaged as it is. But what he's used as his rhythmic basis for this melody is the rhythm of theme 1. This black row here is the rhythm of theme 1, written out, stacked directly over the rhythm of this new theme which we are finding in the development. And if we look, we can start to see that this new theme here is built off of the same rhythmic shapes and lengths of time as the theme 1. Looking here, this grouping exactly lasts the same length as this first note of theme 1. And going on, these two notes, which come as a pair in theme 1, where it goes bum, da-da, those little da-da notes, are taking the same length of time as this note here, which is the next note of this development theme. And you can see it stacking up as we go on. These match here, and this matches here, and we arrive at the same point here. It's really a great way of giving something entirely new, but something that is still linked, connected, and grounded in what was presented beforehand. So, at least on one level, this Oriental section, the development, is simply further developing and exploring the potential of what was presented already in the exposition. Eventually, we end up at a sort of transition area in the music. Some wildly running around arpeggiated chords, which carries us into one more new melodic theme, something we haven't heard before. And this time, it's not really explored or developed. Instead, it's just repeated several times. It's an interesting little insertion. I tend to think of this section as a sort of cadenza section. Remember, I wrote space for cadenza in our structure map. This fast arpeggiated stuff comes to an end, and then there's the fabulous triplet rhythm running up of ascending chords, which are really quite virtuosic in style, leading into that climactically jubilant anthem chorus theme that repeats several times. And it's like we get to enjoy this mountaintop vista for a little while, and then the wildly running arpeggios return to help carry us back down. And where do we find ourselves? Right back where we started, at a sort of recapitulation, but in a really unique twist. Instead of it being either the first or second primary themes of the exposition, remember, I drew an arrow to show you what is the classic recapitulation material. Instead of that, it's what we heard at first as being the introduction material. But it really does feel like a recapping of the piece, where the original material is restated, summed up, so that after all the wonderful musical journey, we are gathered back together. We get to be reminded of how it started, as well as to feel a sense of closure and completion. And then, interestingly, this same theme transforms itself into a kind of coda, repeating over and over as it gradually fades out to the end of the song. So there we have the big, grand scheme of this Peaches and Regalia. And you've noticed that even as we are sketching it out, we've already begun to take note of some of the smaller details of each portion. We begin to feel like we have a general handle on how the music is made. Obviously, even though he follows a general sonata allegro format, we'd never call this an actual sonata movement. It simply doesn't take enough time to actually dig into each part of the structural framework and develop the opportunities that exist there in such a way as to turn it into something that really feels like a sonata. But we see the outline of this design clearly enough to know that Zappa was probably intentional in choosing to use it. It gave him a shape within which he could build his ideas and have some good fun while doing so. Now, as we're working our way through these structural elements, I'd like to remind you that if you want to support my rock journey here on Virgin Rock, and at the same time learn more about music theory and composition techniques, even if you're a total beginner, check out my membership community on Patreon or Ko-fi, where I am presenting a music theory course designed to take absolute beginners all the way to the point that they can write and arrange their own music, understand all music better, and even unlock some of the classical music works. But back to Peaches and Regalia. When I listened the first time, you'll remember I enjoyed the humor of it. And someone commented on that first listen saying they hadn't realized Zappa's music could be so clearly humorous without any lyrics. But it truly is. Listening to a lot of formal classical music, sonatas, concertos, symphonies. A lot of these works are grand, epic even, with deeply emotional content, ranging from the most impressive and powerful to deeply agonizing to playful, humorous, witty, to inexpressibly tender, to ragingly angry, to bitingly sarcastic, acerbic. Zappa's way is to handle it with a sort of brilliant intellectual sense of humor. He's not coarse or crude in his writing. In fact, he's very subtle at times. But it's as if he never really takes it totally seriously. One of the ways in which he communicates this humor is by utilizing such an established classical design to present his musical ideas. Think of it like writing a joke on paper, but instead of scribbling out in some casual lettering, you write it in a very fine calligraphic hand. Or, another way of thinking of it, remember the movie Patch Adams and the way Robin Williams related to the medical establishment? At its superficial level, he was just a clown like the director accused him to be. But in fact, his idea was absolutely brilliant, ingenious, and the results among the patients quickly became manifest. It's kind of like that with Zappa's music, I feel. But there are other elements too, which help to give Peaches and Regalia such a strong and colorful personality. Speaking of colorful, Zappa loves to play with musical color, with tonal layers. Notice how the instruments carrying the leading part, the melody, frequently change and are often paired together to add more tonal complexity. Sometimes it's the flute and guitar. Sometimes it's the sax and guitar. Sometimes it's the piano and guitar. We hear a trio of clarinets. We hear some weird sounds from the guitar in the Oriental section where it seems that he's managed to make the guitar really mimic an Oriental stringed instrument. And then along come the flutes. Sometimes he has the instruments take different roles when a theme returns. For example, at the beginning, we hear the guitar playing the primary motif. But when it comes back at the end, it's not the guitar, it's the organ that takes it over. In this respect, he is handling sound qualities very much like Debussy or Ravel liked to do. Or thinking of someone else who is also quite well known for a biting musical humor, Camille Saint-Saëns. Or let's jump a bit further forward and take into account the rhythmic elements. Of course, we can find obvious influence of jazz, but also the likes of Igor Stravinsky or Edgar Varese. Notice how he loves to give a clear, identifiable rhythm, but which has some element of complexity in it, such as the opening introductory theme, built around a descending sequence of chords, like I played earlier, but which then ends in a fiery, arpeggiated, pianistic flourish. And on top of that, which is all happening very fluidly, he stacks the drums. And remember, in my first listen, I made the comment that the drums almost are layered in such a way that they sound like they are holding the place of a solo instrument. It's very interesting. Or think about the lively theme of the Exposition, which features enough different rhythmic elements as to feel like it really could be part of a notable classical work. Bum, da-da-dum, bum, 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 bum. And then it continues with all the triplets and everything else. Imagine it being played by a trumpet or a piccolo, and just piercing through a symphonic orchestra mass of sound. Well, that's kind of what we heard in the orchestrated version that I listened to as well. We notice that he really hates to repeat himself as the piece progresses. There's always something new around the corner to surprise us, to keep us entertained, engaged, and curious. And then, of course, there is the everything but the kitchen sink in the stylistic references. Now, I've mentioned a lot of them in passing along the way, but let me try to list them now for you. So, we have the rock style, which we hear with the drums, electric guitar, and then there's jazz, which first really steps to the fore in the second main theme, the one that I nicknamed the horn beeping part in the Exposition, just for an easy way to identify it. But we also pick up the jazzy vibe in the percussion style and in how the bass guitar goes walking in the development section. And, of course, the abundant classical influences in terms of tonal coloration, instrumental orchestration, rhythmic play, and form. Then the Oriental references, which come in the development, such as the mimicking of an Oriental plucked instrument, and the gentler, softer rhythms, smooth lines, the pentatonic basis of the melody. Well, of course, pentatonic scales are found all over the world, but here it is clearly being used to allude to Oriental musical styles. Zappa takes all these influences, both deeply traditional as well as quite modern, from all over the world, and fuses them together in a manner that comes across as perfectly natural, interesting, even humorous. As he walks all over the standard conventions and treats them with total irreverence, yet never destroying them. Rather, it's as if he's reapplying, utilizing, appropriating without apology, and presenting them in his very own unique manner. Those are some of what makes it so engaging, so appealing, and so highly entertaining. Now, there's one thing I haven't paid attention to yet at all, and that is the title. There's nothing in the music to really explain what on earth he means. I did search to see if anybody knew anything about what inspired the title, but it seems that everyone is simply guessing. Of course, if we translate it into plain English, it simply means peaches in their full royal dress. Now, it's up to you to interpret that as you please. It makes me think a bit of Prokofiev's satirical opera titled For the Love of Three Oranges. But at least Prokofiev's work explains the title. But in this Peaches and Regalia, it's entirely up to us to decide what to make of it. I think of it as another part of his humor, a sort of joke. Anyway, it adds a nice layer of mystery to the whole thing. I will stop here because I don't want to get too technical. I could go on for hours digging into every minute detail. We could analyze all the chords. We could compare all the themes and see where they relate and where they don't. We could look at every minute detail of the melodies. We could dive into the ensemble, look at every instrumental part on its own merits, and then in relation to what is going on around it. We could find the relationships and interplay between parts, explore the stylistic references, or make detailed comparisons with other composers' works, because it truly is a very rich piece of music. But I'm not going to do that here. We've already uncovered a vast wealth of treasure, which is worth enjoying and exploring just as it stands. Obviously, being the winner of the community vote for the month, many of you enjoy and appreciate Zappa's music, and I know I will come back to it as well. Who knows? Maybe I will do a whole Zappa series at some point in the future. I'll see you soon.